Little boy asked his mother, "If I'm good, will you give me $1?" To which she replied, "Why don't you be good for nothing like your father?" Now, sometimes we, Jesus would tell us even as Christians, can be good for nothing. Good for nothing more than to be trodden under the foot of men, to be cast out. Matthew 5 and verse 13, if we're not doing our job as the salt of the earth, our subject of the evening, then that's exactly what we are. We are good for nothing. I want to talk about salt tonight and how Christians and salt are related in the wonderful symbolic illustration that we find in salt. But by way of introduction, I want you to think about the chemistry of salt for just a moment. I think it's very interesting that Jesus, that God in His omniscience, in His all-knowing mind, would take two elements, sodium, which is something that, it's a metal, it's an alkaline metal, but it's a soft metal. It's kind of like the texture of a hard cheese from what I was reading. And chemistry students, and I was never big into chemistry, maybe some of you know a little more about this, but apparently you can put it in water and it can be very dangerous. It quickly turns orange and can even explode from what I understand, and they like to play with that. But it has a poisonous effect when it's intaken in the body. And then you have the other aspect of this, the other element, which is chlorine. And in its gas form as well, to intake that is very poisonous. And so God, chemically speaking, if that's a word, I can just make that up for a moment, He takes these two elements and He places them, they're both poisonous, deadly, and when you put them together, you get sodium chloride or salt, table salt, something that we need in life, that we couldn't eat food. Food would just not be near as good without that salt, right? Without that seasoning. It's so interesting, and yet there's a beautiful illustration in that. Because salt is related, he says, to a Christian. We are to be salt. And so God takes two poisonous, if you will, or awful things in that you've got this wicked sinner, you and I, that He takes, and He combines it with a cruel and awful death on that cross. And when you put those two things together, you get someone who's fit for the kingdom of heaven. What a wonderful illustration as God would use salt in that chemistry there, in that picture that He alludes to. But let's take a few moments and look at a few things that correlate salt with Christianity, and I believe that Jesus meant in referencing this example. Number one, that may be the most obvious, salt seasons. Job 6 and verse 6, very interesting passage. He says, "How are you going to eat an unsavory meal without salt?" And then he goes on to say, "Is there any taste in the white of an egg?" Right? We recently, Amber, actually, I think it might have been when my mother was in town, but anyways, for some reason we have an egg white, like not a jar, but what do you call it, a carton, I guess, a half gallon of egg whites in the fridge. I've always just eaten eggs, but apparently it's more healthy to just eat the whites of an egg. And so I decided to make an omelet out of that. I had to salt that a lot in order for me to like it. It's very true. I can't think of a better example than egg whites. They're just very bland without salt. Right? And so the picture here is you are the salt of the earth. One of the implications is you're the seasoning, you're the flavor. Right? I've gotten into the Food Network lately. I'm really enjoying watching some of these. Again, man, you'd probably make fun of me for this, but I'm into the cooking kind of thing now. It's very interesting to me, but if you don't season your food right, if you don't put enough salt, then you're going to lose that competition, that food competition, or you're going to, it's not going to be real good, right? You know how salt works. We are the flavor of this world. Think about that for a minute. What a privilege, what an honor that God would allow His children, us, if you're a child of God, to be the ones to give this world flavor. Right? You might say this world would be a better place if it was full of Christians. Now, I'm not talking about what the religious world calls a Christian, because there's plenty of those that are ruining the name of Christian in their hypocritical lives, and not that we're perfect and don't make mistakes. But as we talked about this morning, there's a difference between someone who's trying to do the will of the Father. And if you put in this world and just fill it with people who are truly faithful Christians, then this world would be a better place. There's no doubt about it. And so, unfortunately, that's not the way it is, though. There's only few, as the Bible would put it. That's a narrow path, and so as the salt, we have a job to get out and to season the world. Colossians 4 and verse 6 references the speech. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt. Your words, your actions, all that you do flavors the world around us. What an awesome picture and privilege that is from God to us. Not only does salt season, it preserves. You know this. These first two are very commonly known. We understand these two, but we can't leave this out, this idea of preservation. It's interesting, when Jesus was preaching this in Matthew 5, this Sermon on the Mount, he had a lot of fishermen in his audience. A lot of folks did that for a living. For their trade back then was fishing. And you remember what fishermen did. They would take these fish, and you know how to clean a fish. Many of you guys especially probably know and how that process works. We won't go into detail, but at the end of that process, when you've got what's left, maybe today you just go and you would cook it or you'd stick it in the freezer. Well, for them, if they're going to sell this fish, they need it to last. They want to keep it from rotting, from decaying. So what they would do is take salt, and they would rub that salt on that meat, and that would preserve it. And so there's a beautiful picture there too, in that we are the salt of the earth. We're preserving this world, this nation. Have you ever thought about that? Genesis chapter 18, when Abraham, he's having this discussion with God, and God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. The iniquity is full in a sense. I'll explain that in a moment. But he says, I'm going to destroy it. And Abraham says, listen, if I can find 50 righteous people, just 50, will you spare Sodom and Gomorrah? Absolutely. If you find 50, I'll do it. 50 couldn't be found. He said, well, what if we lack 5? King James Version, from that number. That would be 45. God says, I'll spare it. He goes down the list. 40, can't find it. 30, can't find it. 20, all the way down to 10. God, if I can find 10 righteous people in Sodom, will you spare it from destruction? Will that be enough to preserve Sodom and Gomorrah? God says, absolutely. But as you well know, by the end of the story, there were only 4. When you push the sons-in-law aside who wouldn't leave and obey the will of God, and then, of course, Lot's wife that ends up falling away immediately, turning her back, and so really 3, I guess, at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. But if there had just been 10, he would have spared Sodom and Gomorrah. What does that say for us in this country? You know, we sometimes worry about our nation, and rightly so. We're headed in a direction that we're not happy with, that we're not proud of for so many reasons. Abortion, and now it's homosexual marriage. It's just going to move on. It's just, if the current path continues, it's going to get worse and worse. But what's going to keep this nation under God? What's going to keep this nation from destroying itself? It's going to be Christians. They are the salt. They are the preservation. Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach unto any people. I think of Genesis 15:16, and when I say that Sodom and Gomorrah's iniquity was full, that's a reference from Genesis 15:16. When he's talking to Abraham, he puts Abraham in this deep sleep, and he's talking to him about the fact that there's going to be a 400-year, you recall, and he's referencing the bondage, and he mentions the Amorites, and he says that it's not time yet because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. There was a gauge in God's eyes as to when that nation, that group of individuals, was so wicked and there was so little righteous left that he would destroy it, but it wasn't there yet. Very interesting to me. Maybe it was that sin had just not defiled all men yet. I don't know. But this Gentile nation was not yet full of iniquity. But when they became full, God would destroy them. God has never destroyed a nation that was full or had any amount of righteous people whatsoever. And when He did, He always spared the righteous. Don't forget that. He always did. Go back to the flood. I mean, millions and millions of people estimated to have been alive. There were only 8. They didn't save the world, but in a sense they did because God spared them, right? He didn't leave Noah and his family, those 8 souls, hanging. We need to remember, as bad as it may get in this nation, as long as we're faithful to God, we are its preservation. You know, we'll never be thanked for that. We'll never be looked at in that way, and we don't need to look at it, of course, and get haughty or self-righteous or any of that stuff. Don't misunderstand me. But we need to be confident, and we need to remember and have peace within ourselves, knowing that as long as we're here, and as long as we're the salt of this nation, we will preserve her to some degree. And so there's great comfort in that. We need to be the preservation of this world. Not only that, but salt maybe is not as commonly known. It has a healing effect. In 2 Kings, the Bible mentions this a couple of times, but in 2 Kings chapter 2, Elijah hands over the mantle to Elisha. And when Elisha takes over, immediately the people begin to complain about the water in Jericho. The land is barren and the water's no good. We need to do something about this. And of all things, Elisha says, bring me this chur, I believe the King James Version calls it. In essence, what he says is, I'm going to salt this water. And so he takes some salt, goes to the spring waters, or the waters where the springs are coming up there, and he puts salt in it, and the Lord says, through Elisha, that these waters have now been healed. They've been cleansed, and so the land will no longer be dead and barren. So you see this picture of a healing effect with salt. Furthermore, Ezekiel 16, verse 4, a very interesting passage when God's talking about Israel as a nation, and he says, your birth, when I birthed you, Israel, and brought you into the promised land, he says, I didn't cut your umbilical cord. Read it, Ezekiel 16:4. I didn't cut your umbilical cord. He says, I didn't wash you with water. I didn't swaddle you in clothes. These are all things that they would normally do with a baby. And the fourth one, really third in the list, but the last one I'll mention, he says is, I did not salt you. What did he mean by that? Well, historically, what they would do is they would take that baby and rub that baby down with salt. Why? Because it would help fight infection, they believed, and rightly so. It had a healing effect to that salt. That was one of the things that they would use it for. And so as the salt of the earth, we are to have a healing effect. Now, how do we apply that? Well, this is what I want you to think of. Not necessarily evangelism, we'll get there in a minute, but think about it this way. Do you know somebody who is part of the world? They're not a Christian. Maybe they're a co-worker or a friend from school or an acquaintance of yours to some degree, and you spend time around them on occasion, and you know that normally they use foul language and say things that you wouldn't approve of, but you notice when they're around you, they respect you sometimes, and maybe they don't use those words they would normally use. They don't reference those things, or when they're with you, they don't maybe drink like they normally would because they know that you are offended by that. You don't like that. And so in that sense, I think about this healing effect. When people are around us, it ought to, and again, we need to be out, not of the world, but we have to be in the world. We're not going to be able to bring people to Christ if we're not in the world to a degree, not participating in sin, but being around those that are in the world. And so we're around these people, and hopefully when they see how we act and how we talk, hopefully that's becoming of a Christian, then they say, I'm going to be a little different around them because they're different. And it might just happen that in time this healing effect happens and they begin to become more and more like that person that they're seeing in you. And one day end up being led to the gospel. There's a healing effect. In whatever way you want to apply this, we need to be healers of this world. We live in a very, very sinful world. Let me take that a step further. Makes thirsty. You ever eaten some, let's say potato chips. Maybe it's a bag of those greasy Lay's potato chips. You're in the car or something, and what do you need? It doesn't take long if you're like me and you need some water. Maybe you're eating some popcorn and you dump salt on it like I do, and it doesn't take long. You need to drink some water, right? Salt has a way also of making you thirsty. It makes you need something to drink. It makes you desire it. I think there's a great application here. As Christians, being salt, can you still hear me? Okay, I think my ear did one of those ringing things and I thought I lost you. But anyways, it's me going deaf up here. As Christians, being salt, we have this ability and this privilege to make people thirsty. At least we need to. In other words, we should cause people to want to be or to have what we have. Have you ever known somebody that you just thought, I really wish I was like them? Maybe it's a celebrity. Maybe, we just have that time when you want to be a movie star or you want to be like somebody else. Or maybe it's more realistic and it's somebody, no offense, maybe it's somebody at work that always has a positive attitude. And you're kind of down from time to time and you just think, man, I really want to be able to have an attitude, to be happy all the time like them. That ought to be us. We ought to be, being part of the abundant life, a happy, a peaceful people. And when those around us see that, they ought to think to themselves, I want what he has. I want what she has. Why is she or she always at peace? Why is Billy Bob always smiling and always nice and kind? And here I am over here moping at, right? But a lot of times we don't enjoy the Christian life. For some reason we take it for granted and we worry about things we ought not, and we don't give an image that would cause others to want to have what we have in Christ, right? We can have the opposite effect. We can cause people not to be thirsty at all. Jesus says in John 7, for those who are thirsty, He's going to give them drink. Verse 38, it's going to be the water of life, that eternal living water as he describes it. We have to live our lives in a way that we're an example and a light and a positive attitude kind of a person, so that others are going to want to have and be what and who we are. You don't have to be the President of the United States for somebody to respect you and look up to you. You can just be a hard worker. Everybody has their talents. Everybody has things that they can use to be a positive influence and to cause others to think, man, I want to be like that. I want to be a Christian. And then when they realize why you feel the way that you do, they might just want to know more. You make people thirsty for the truth. What about this one? Salt irritates. You ever heard the expression, he just poured salt on the wound? You ever heard that one? If you pour salt, don't do it. But if you pour salt on a wound, what happens? It burns. It irritates. It makes me cringe just thinking about it. It hurts, right? You've ever had a chapped lips or a cut lip and you took a bite of something real salty? You remember what that felt like? It burns, right? There's so many things about salt. It's very interesting to me. Mark 9 and verse 49, Jesus says, he's referencing hell, and of all the details about hell,